Thanks, Nigel. Do switch off your machines, switch off your cameras, and hopefully we will then be able to. I mean, everyone's now rejoining now for the next panel session. Great stuff. Shaping the future. We're going to talk for 40 minutes or so around shaping the future. And really looking at how we should be developing our skills, priorities, and strategy for the transport future. We have a cast of thousands joining me here, cast of thousands. Everyone's been briefed to be very, very concise. In fact, I'm going to do it by putting some questions to everyone. I'm going to do it to try and get some more interaction going. I'm going to put a load of questions. Let me introduce our panel. Emily Seabrook, welcome, Emily. Give us a wave, Emily, just so people know who you are. Welcome, Emily. Also, let me introduce Steve Gooding. Steve, yeah, Steve, you're there. Steve Gooding, welcome to the panel. Abi Nichols, Abi, yeah, you're there. And Gemma Ball from the Catapult. I will introduce you just before we start. But let me just put a few quick questions to everyone just to get us cracking before we move to the panel session. But if you do want to just jump in at any point, anyone who wants to answer the questions, then do that. But Emily, let's start with Emily Seabrook. Emily is going to give us a view of the future as a Heartland-based graduate engineer with Skanska. In fact, Emily, you were the winner of the England's Economic Heartland Young Professionals Vision 2050 competition, which was judged by a whole range of hugely important people, such as Sadie Morgan of the National Infrastructure Commission, to mention just one. I'll start with you. I mean, the world is changing rapidly. Emily, we've heard, everyone that's spoken this morning has mentioned this, external forces such as COVID, climate change. I mean, what is your vision for transport in 2050? And I bet you didn't, when you wrote your piece one year, the award, I bet you didn't even think about coronavirus, did you? Emily, what do you think? Yeah. What's your vision?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't on my agenda back in December. I think a successful transport system would allow the everyday commuter to get from A to B using many different modes of transport seamlessly. And I think there'll be a lot less reliance on the private car, and culturally supported active travel would just become the default norm for society. And I think this can be really underpinned by like 3 key values or design principles, you could call them. So it's got to be holistic, and it's got to be intelligent and iterative. So holistic, thinking about the bigger picture of how the Heartland's actually working and how the people are actually interacting. And then it's got to be intelligent, so picking up that data from their movements and picking up that data to inform the iterative design, so working out where the hotspots are in the network. And this kind of intelligent data can be iterative to inform the user where's best to go, how's best to get there, and also to inform the road managers of where do we need to be improving the system, or where do we need to be doing like holistic big picture design and thinking. But okay. I think also we need to be thinking.
Yeah, Karen, sorry, I interrupted you, apologies.
No problem. If we're living in kind of the car-free cities and we're all doing active travel seamlessly across many different modes, we need to think, how can freight work? So freight needs to be able to sit alongside this. So I think a big focus will be on the carbon heavy last mile, because we all like our stuff to come to us. So perhaps using consolidation centres to rethink how freight works, and demanding that the companies work together to provide net zero for like our betterment, really.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, what do you see as the major changes that we face when it comes to the next generation's use of transport, and the way that you are kind of, we heard earlier about the need to perhaps reframe our thinking away from cars being the obvious way to travel, more towards the fact that, I mean, bikes are changing. We have mechanical doping now, where bikes are available to all sorts of folks who to travel huge amounts of distance using electric power. But how do you see young people, the next generation, actually using the transport system?
I think as young people, net zero is massively in our favour, and having a shift in how we use the transport system is going to happen, like no matter what, because a lot of journeys are being turned on their head. So we've got our stuff coming to us, but also we're changing how we're living. So a transport system needs to be very in touch with the data of how we're buying houses in different locations, commuting differently, and perhaps just the culture. We need to be aware of the culturally supported active travel and providing the infrastructure to allow us to live net zero, because as a young person we might see the immediate barriers of the train perhaps being more expensive than the car. It perhaps doesn't weigh up at the moment, so I think the provision needs to be there for it to be illogical to take the private car and for it to be the natural move to take a net zero decision by default.
So did your work on your vision? I mean, it used to be, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting. My son has just passed his driving test, and I suppose when I passed my driving test, it was a different. It was a different thing. It feels like, you know, for him, it's not such a necessity. It's more of a sort of a life kind of mark, but it's not a necessity. When I was passing, it felt like a necessity. Is it still easy and cool to use a car, or is it kind of going the other way? You know, is it uncool to use a car nowadays?
Well, I hope one day it will just be not a question. Like, I hope at the moment, I think it's cool to use the car because, well, you don't want to be the awkward one leaving the dinner party at like 8:50 because the train leaves at 8:53 to get home safely in the dark. And I think if there's that provision of really good infrastructure and really seamless connections, it just won't be a thing to use the private car, and it will be the default will be for us to use kind of the nodes outside the city and to use the eco-friendly, sustainable methods of transport.
Okay. So based upon your the work that you did with your vision, what has to happen next then? How do we move to this new paradigm?
I can only speak from my generation's perspective, really, because that's all I've got experience of. But I think we can't expect the perfect transport system to land on our plate. So I think we need, as young people, have a say and to get involved, because if not, net zero is going to be my problem when I'm a chartered engineer later down the line, and I don't want to be untangling that mess because something wasn't done now. And I think if we have the means as young people, it's really great that we could live kind of disruptively, so we could live as if we plan to in 2050. So, for example, even though it's a bit annoying to take my bike onto the train, get the train and then cycle the other end, at least then I can identify the pinch points in the network and flag them up at, for example, the draft transport consultation. And I can flag things up like that because I'm making people aware that we do need more from our transport system if we are going to live net zero and make use of all these innovations that are available to us.
Yeah, well, Emily, thanks a lot. I mean, we're going to come back to and discuss a few more general points, and certainly, Steve, I'm going to be putting you on the spot in terms of, you know, your responsibilities in terms of what, you know, of driving the agenda for the next generation as well. But let me turn to our next speaker, Abi Nichols. Oh, by the way, I've just realised that I didn't introduce George Nicola. George, you were hiding behind my control panel. I didn't see you there landing there, George. There you go. Look, I can see you now. George from the Catapult as well, systems architect from the Catapult. I'll introduce you in a minute, but welcome. Abi Nichols, though, first. Abi is transport strategy project lead with the Heartland, well, can you outline your connectivity studies and how these have influenced the transport priorities that you've been planning? I suppose, you know, what do you see as the transport strategies? You know, what are the transport strategies for, and how they're going to help shape the future connectivity in the region, Abi?
Yeah, really interested to hear Emily's point about holistic transport systems. I think that's very much what we've been approaching in our transport strategy, very much seeing the transport system as a system, integration of modes, and taking that forward within our connectivity studies. So we are planning a series of connectivity studies, which we've outlined in our draft transport strategy, and there's an attachment on the side pane as well, which shows the programme of studies that we're planning on taking forward. But our studies are very much looking forward to how we can take our draft transport strategy policies and principles through to actual action. So really planning in how we use that vision of connecting the Heartland. Regional connectivity is obviously in essence is what we do and what we really want to see within defined areas in a way which is looking at both physical and digital connectivity. So I've heard the importance of digital connectivity already quite a lot this morning. So really taking that holistic view of trying to connect people within defined areas across both those things, taking into account the principles of our transport strategy. So they're looking at decarbonisation, quality of life, freight, really connecting people as well. So taking a holistic view of, before about not just assessing costs, so benefit cost ratios, but also looking at how that can meet the decarbonisation agenda, the environmental net gain agenda. So really looking at a series of connectivity solutions and opportunities within those defined areas that we can take forward to our transport strategy investment pipeline to then take forward to delivery. So it's very much about working with our partners to look to the future. So this section here is about how we look to the future. What do partners see as their aspirations for defined areas? So our local authority partners, enterprise partnerships. There's a lot of economic activity and economic ambition for the area. So how do we make that a reality by delivering connectivity solutions which meet the ambitions for those people within those areas? So it's really about looking to the future, working with our partners to see what we need to deliver to help connectivity in those areas.
Okay, and certainly when you were addressing those principles and policies in the transport study, I mean, you were looking at things such as travel hierarchy. I mean, how is that all kind of shifting and changing? We heard this morning a lot of questions coming in around that hierarchy perhaps changing. What do you how do you build that into the work you're doing?
Yeah, so we're really keen to get a balanced programme for our investment pipeline, and that is very much taking into account the travel hierarchy. So within our transport strategy, one of our policies is around having a travel hierarchy, which we have active travel modes at the top, and then working down we have public transport, so quite a traditional travel hierarchy. But we really want to take that into account in how we assess some of the solutions that might be put forward for connectivity in that region. So not just think about roads, and we're very clear that we might need to address roads. So Greg Smith mentioned before about wing and particular issues on the network that we might look at through these studies, and I like to look at through the studies, but really thinking about actually what is that travel hierarchy. We want people to be using active travel modes to get to a station, thinking about how places are built, making nice places to live, as well as just connecting by roads. So we really want to get to the balanced programme. So we're really thinking about those travel hierarchy, putting active travel modes first, but also, again, that links through to how we can achieve some of the decarbonisation commitments and priorities that we have within the transport strategy. So it is very much thinking about what we put in our transport strategy and really trying to take that through to action.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, and for action for you, I mean, that is all about really trying to deliver that towards packages of work, presumably, packages of delivery. What happens next?
Yeah, so as part of the study, we're looking to commission the studies as to essentially get to an ultimate point where we have packages of interventions that will meet the connectivity ambitions and challenges. So we are hoping to go through a study process, which is almost a non-traditional study process, so very much making it a holistic transport system approach, where we go through, work with our partners, think about scenario setting, think about long list of interventions that might meet those scenarios, assessing those interventions against some of the things we talked about, the travel hierarchy, the principles, to get to a point where we have a package, a series of packages which we think will meet those, which provide good value for money, but also meet decarbonisation and all those bits and pieces in a way which is also brought into partner support, which we can then feed into our investment pipeline within the transport strategy, which we hope to refresh on a 5-year basis, and then take those forward, working with our partners to recommend next steps to how we get to delivery. And they mentioned at the beginning also thinking that the good way forward for us would be a regional funding settlement to be able to then deliver those things within our transport strategy. That's really important, having the certainty around where the funding is coming from to be able to take those next steps.
And presumably that will also include tackling issues such as mentioned by Paul, which is about breaking down silos, really getting people thinking holistically about the way that they deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are very much studies about working with our partners and taking on local ambitions. Again, working across the boundaries. So a lot of the areas do cross local authority boundaries. So for example, some of the the corridors are, for example, kind of London, Buckinghamshire, Milton Keynes, Northampton, and that goes across a few local authority boundaries. And so it will be very much about working with partners in all those places to make sure we come up with a study brief that, it's never easy to get a study brief that everybody agrees with, but to get to a point where people are happy to take forward a study brief that meets the needs of all those partners.
Okay, we'll come back in a few moments, Abi, and drill into some more issues around that when we get into some questions from the floor, but also some more panel discussion. But let's hear now. Let's go into space. Let's hear from Gemma Ball, Business Development and Transport Lead at the Satellite Applications Catapult, and also Gemma is joined by George Nicola, Business Development Technical Solutions Architect, also with the Catapult. Now you're going to talk to us about the role that space plays in the development space. As a very, am I saying that right? Space, in a very Trumpian way. Yeah. Space. So the way that the role that space plays in the development and the decarbonisation of intelligent transport infrastructure. Gemma, to what extent? Well, tell us about your work. How are you going to make that happen? To what extent do you see the current COVID pandemic accelerating our move towards positive climate factors?
Well, I actually think so. So thank you, Anthony, and thanks so far for the introduction. I'm really inspired by the holistic viewpoints from the previous speakers. I agree with it immensely. But I actually want to draw an example of how COVID has really accelerated the net zero goals that we wish to achieve. And actually, prior to COVID, were they ever really achievable? Because yes, we are going to be going down the road of electronic vehicles, but actually we travel more than ever. So for me, we're starting to assess why we need to travel. And what I actually want to draw attention to is because of COVID, we had to diversify our business to include new strategies in order to achieve the net zero goals that we're looking at in transport. And because we are working remotely and because we're working more effectively by that, we actually were able to recruit George, who is nowhere near our region and wouldn't normally probably come and work at Harwell, but because we are able to work remote and actively work remotely, that has enabled a really fantastic relationship. So, but what satellites do is they empower network infrastructure, and they empower because they communicate, they provide insight, they navigate. And I think when we start realizing about what connectivity can do, enabled by such interventions such as satellites, it starts allowing us to say, well, actually, do we need to travel? And actually, why do we have to travel? And I think this really starts to sort of reflect on the regional ambitions to sort of create new skills and services. And what I also believe as well is you can also be a farmer and still work in a digital environment too. So that's why I think satellites are going to be a bit of a forefront in that delivery service. And the more people realize what satellites can do, the more they'll see that they very much integrate with most of the technologies that we've got on our around us today. And we have had some new strong government agenda items that have come out very recently, and not face-to-face meetings, I might add as well, where we've seen new developments. And I think this will empower the region.
Okay, so when you talk about I mean, what you're effectively talking about is the use of more connected digital technologies. I mean, is that? I mean, you talk about the use of satellites, but effectively, what you're really trying to encourage is the use of more digital connected technologies. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we talk about how we work remotely, to be effective in your work remotely, you need to be connected. Now, I live in Buckinghamshire and I live in a nice, lovely village. And yes, we have many spots where not always is it able to be connected. So what we want to do is provide resilience against that. And satellites can do that for you. So
obviously the reason I was, because the point that was made by the MP earlier, Greg Smith, was around this, the provision of fast fiber. I mean, so how do you, what is the relationship? Just give us a quick kind of like A to B on the relationship between satellite technology and fast fiber and building those kind of networks.
Well, this is where I'd like to bring to the floor George, because George is the technical solutions architect. So we have a very great way of working together at the Catapult. The Catapult brings in people with hard skills such as myself, business development, very much about user requirements, so engaging with primes and SMEs and government agenda. And then we also attract hopefully very talented people like George, who has the technical understanding of how all this would work together to create such a system.
George.
Thanks, George.
Welcome.
So thank you, Gemma. I could almost feel that coming my way. So good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm the technical solutions architect at the Satellite Applications Catapult, supporting intelligent transport solutions. But to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually a child engineer myself, an avionics engineer by trade, so I default to things that fly. So you'll have to forgive me if I move to urban air mobility at any point during the conversation. But to answer your question, Anthony, about how satellites and fiber coexist, if you will, one of the programs we've been looking at actually now and architecting around one of the government initiatives through OneWeb, in fact, was about hybridizing 5G and satellite. So one of the things about ubiquitous connectivity is, it is actually, when we say ubiquitous connectivity and bridging the digital divide, we actually mean everywhere, right? And that is an issue for lots of cellular providers, because you have to roll out some significant infrastructure to provide that connectivity. So fiber, 5G nodes, etc., etc. So, and that's an undertaking. And sometimes in the really rural areas, the business case just doesn't stack up. Now, imagine a world where you don't have to put the backhaul in place and you can do it over satellite. So now you no longer need to have that infrastructure roll out. What you need to do is a more simple crowd cell, for example, that could be deployed remotely, and then you can backhaul the traffic over satellite, which is an infrastructure which is already in space. So now you can extend the reach of your broadband networks without necessarily actually having to put the broadband network in place.
Right, so it's a way of more efficiently, more cost effectively delivering in perhaps in rural areas such as the Heartland. One of the things, okay, the next step towards that, maybe this is one for Gemma, is how does that help you to travel? How does it help you? And the phrase I think you use is travel because you want to, not because you have to. Are you trying to create a world where everyone sits at home all the time?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, I consider myself to be quite a social butterfly, and I certainly don't like sitting at home staring at four walls all the time. But actually, if I think about my life today and how it's changed rapidly since commuting all the time into the office, trying to get through traffic, trying to get back to childcare, trying just to, you work in almost to live, when actually that's probably not the agenda that we wanted to start off with, especially when we're thinking about children. What you want is a combination of all. So you want to be able to, know that you can go into the office and actually you're not necessarily timetabled to a structure. The idea that you have to wait for a bus or have to leave early because you must get this bus or it's the last one, that's not the world we want to live in today. We want to be able to have travel in an autonomous fashion.
Emily, is that right? Is she right about the world you want to live in?
Yeah, exactly. Like, if I could seamlessly get from A to B without even noticing that I'd travelled from A to B, that would be fantastic. Okay. And to just say at the end of it, it just works.
Well, Gemma, how do you what are the critical steps towards? I mean, give Abi some advice about the critical steps towards creating this truly intelligent transport solution.
Well, I think that's one of the key elements there that you've just stated, is actually finding out the information from those that know best. So we are a Satellite Applications Catapult. It's our job to foster relationships between government and primes. So I would absolutely reach out to Skanska, and have been doing so, to factor in what are the requirements and actually what's the adaptability to integrate some of the solutions that we're offering, because there is going to be lots of adversary against, and particularly in rail as well, what this new solution will mean and why would it work better. And then not to obviously sort of put in sort of the criticisms, but you've got to factor in costs and safety. And what we're saying is actually, by bringing in together environmental needs, economic needs, but people's needs to travel and why they do, actually we could have a far more agile environment where, maybe I don't need to be in the office for 9, I can be in the office for 10 and still be as productive and actually optimize my work effectively. And I have to say, I think in lockdown, because we have got this no more 9-to-5 working day, I think lots of us are seeing far more productivity than we've ever seen before, because we haven't got the stress of commuting.
Gemma, thank you very much. There's lots of questions coming in, and I'm going to get to those, in one of which actually says, very true, Gemma, from Sean Brown. Very true, Gemma. I'm not sure what he was referring to, but take it. Yeah, very true, Gemma. Thanks, Sean. Let us know what else you want to say about that, which particular point you think was very true. But until then, let me introduce our final speaker, Steve Gooding. Steve, welcome. Steve is the director of the RAC Foundation. Steve, you want to set out the challenges or set out the connectivity challenges of rural communities within the Heartland? I mean, we hear a lot about the future of cities, Steve, when we talk about transport strategies. But of course, this region is largely rural. I mean, how does that impact the future? How does that change the way we need to be thinking about the solutions? Steve?
Well, I think we've heard quite a bit about that from speakers this morning, right from the outset when Baroness Veer was on, but also picking up, for example, from Gemma saying what it's like to live in a small village and have other commitments that you're trying to fit round in a largely car-dependent world. And I think it's just fair to say that we need to start where we are, and where we are is that rural communities tend to be more car-dependent, and also they're extremely hard to provide what we might think of as traditional public transport or mass transit solutions, because the brute fact is, if you haven't got that many people, creating a viable business case to run a public transport service is very hard.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose I can see them coming in saying now, you know, RAC Foundation, he would say that, wouldn't he? Cars are the solution. But I mean, are you talking about cars as we know them today, or are you thinking that the cars that you are seeing as the backbone of the rural communities need to change from what they are at the moment?
Well, I think that I would start by saying that I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying we need to be realistic where we're starting from. The fact is, even your son has decided to get a driving license. When the DVSA reopened bookings for car tests 2 weeks ago, the site crashed. When I spoke to the chief exec yesterday, he said that when they offered 375,000 tests, they were snapped up within about an hour. So there's a lot of people thinking that if they want to have access to jobs, employment, if they want to get to where they need to be, then maybe they need to drive to get there. But I think we are on the edge of seeing some very big changes in the way we think about transport, which Emily and others have pointed towards. Part of which is changes in the vehicles themselves. Increasingly, they could be powered in a zero tailpipe way, as the MP, Greg Smith, was talking about earlier. Might be electric, might be battery electric, might be hydrogen. There might be 2, 3 or 4 wheel vehicles. There might be electrically boosted, but things like electrically boosted bicycles or scooters. I think personally I'd feel slightly nervous riding an electric scooter down some of the country lanes in England's economic heartland, but it might be something that we'll look at. But I think the other part of it is we've really got to think about the trips that we make. And that takes me to, I think, the point several people made about the need to travel. And I think we need to distinguish what do we need to do and what do we want to do, because they're not always the same. Okay. And I've certainly found in the last 6 months, I don't think I've traveled less in the last 30 years, but I've certainly been at work almost every day, frankly, almost every day, including the weekends. And it feels a bit less like working from home and a bit more like living at work, to be honest. But how we get that balance right, how we get more things coming to us, maybe more deliveries at home, less trips to retail, and more working as George is doing remotely, but in a very connected way. I think it's the pattern of trips that's got to change.
But there's a big push, of course, right now to get people going back to the office, to get people to start to, I suppose, get back to what what we call as a normal life. But I mean, how do you see the future? The future, as far as I can hear from what you're saying, is probably not going to be back to normal.
I have my doubts. I mean, I think there's something interesting in the fact that surveys recently showing the tendency of white-collar workers to return to office jobs running at about 75 to 80% going back to the office in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, less than 40% in this country. Now, I think there's a big London effect there. Having been into our office in central London, I think a lot of people are thinking very hard about that 90 minutes there and back, morning and night, which wasn't always the best part of the day for them, quite apart from the fact they might be saving quite a bit of money not doing that. And they might be tempted to look at some of the villages in England's economic heartland and be thinking, I could live there. I'm only going to go into my office maybe once or twice a fortnight, so I'll put up with a longer travel to go in occasionally for the benefits that I would get of having perhaps a more rural location, a bigger garden, that sort of thing, maybe a shorter trip to school when we're taking the kids in. So I think there might be some pressures the other way.
That's a point. I mean, just a point made by Neil Middleton on the questions here, Steve. You know, Neil says, to me, it's not a debate about go to work from home or go to the workplace. It's about how do you mix the two and what is the best choice for your various activities? Concentrate at home, interact in the workplace. I mean, is this, what do you agree?
I couldn't agree more. I think he's absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think that for different businesses, there will be different solutions. For the very small business that I run, the team, we've had a conversation about this. The general view is most of the time people are happier working remotely, but we do want to get together from time to time. And actually, we don't really want to come into the office in dribs and drabs and perhaps one of us on Monday and another one on Tuesday. We'd far rather find ways of getting everyone together once a month. But actually, the rest of the time, what we've done is have far more regular catch-up conversations using technology like this. And I think that many offices, many managers are finding that that was a more efficient way of working for them. It's not going to work for everyone, because let's face it, some people aren't as lucky as us to have nice houses that they could be working from. They're living in shared houses. They might be sitting in a bedroom. Some friends of ours are having to take turns who gets the chair so they could be working on the laptop. So it won't work for everyone. But I think that mixed pattern, that's really where we're heading.
We've heard a lot about the challenge of hitting net zero targets. I'm going to put that question via Alex Poppleton, actually, who sent a question in saying, Steve, how do we get affluent baby boomers from buying 4x4 SUVs that are having a big impact on the environmental damage? Can the RAC run a campaign, or the RAC Foundation, I imagine it means, run a campaign to make them aware of the damage they're doing? Can you also include their campaign against idling? I presume it means car engine idling and not idling.
We've previously supported the government campaign, which was rather aptly titled "Idling Gets You Nowhere," and we certainly support local authorities taking a tougher line on that. Certainly people sitting there with their engines running when they shouldn't be, particularly diesel engines, no one's going to support that. I should stress for people on the conference, we're not the breakdown boys, we don't have the orange vans, we're a think tank, so we don't actually do that much by way of public campaigning. But I think we would always encourage people to think about the vehicle that they need, and it's all about choosing the right tool for the job. So I'm moderately sympathetic to people who want to choose a vehicle that they feel is more comfortable and safer, particularly if they're carrying a family around. But to think, do we have to use the same vehicle for every trip? A vast majority of people who own a motor vehicle also own a bicycle.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to come to some more questions, but I'm just, Emily, what's your view on campaigning against large 4x4 SUVs? Is it a point that's important, or is it a distraction?
I personally think that we shouldn't be needing to campaign, and we shouldn't be forcing people out of what they want, but we should provide something so much better that they automatically want to choose that. So kind of, you've heard probably about the nudge theories that they're using in the government. So to provide something so seamless and connected and affordable that it kind of seems illogical to use the SUV or private car. And I completely agree with Steve saying the right tool for the job. So everything kind of needs to be tailored in our modern society, and that applies to transport and how we get around.
That goes back to Gemma and your travel because we want to and not because we have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we should discriminate against the vehicle type that anybody has or wishes to use. I think what we need to do is go back to what Emily says and actually provide that autonomy. So, you know, if you need a bigger car to do whatever you want to do this particular week, then that's available to you. And, you know, I very much do promote the autonomous driving world that we wish to seek. I think that would be a really effective use of everybody's time. But I also want to address, you know, Steve's topic about, you know, the accessibility for people to work remotely. If we weren't building bigger roads, and I know that might seem quite sort of controversial to Emily, but if we weren't necessarily, you know, going ahead with planned expenditures and actually start diversifying that budget to really address the levelling up agenda, I think you'll naturally see a net zero carbon achievement quicker anyway. You know, maybe we can change some of the ways in which we no longer need retail establishments and actually create innovation hubs where people could work remotely from them, you know, such things as that. Okay. I think would be a really empowering tool.
Abi, a question for you here. Could Abi be looking at engaging local residents as part of the connectivity studies alongside environmental impact? Is the obvious and gaping hole, Abi?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're really conscious that we want to provide things that residents want, and through engaging with local authorities know their patches, they know the residents in their areas. It's really important to listen to the local authorities and what they think the residents might want. There will be, I think, a time where we will want to talk to the public, and when that is in the studies, I think that needs really careful consideration with partners, and particularly with thinking about visions and what we want for the future. Those are quite maybe some sensitive discussions, so I think those need to happen with the local partners first. But I think there's definitely a point where we don't want to be delivering things that people don't want. So I think, yes, that's a really good point.
A question from David Sprunt, actually, building on people's side is very important. Lockdown has shown how the trend to smaller homes, flats these days don't facilitate working from home very well. I think that's perhaps a point you made, Steve. We need not just good internet access, but well-designed homes that allow space for working from home, or neighbourhoods that provide facilities built in where people can easily go to work. Who wants to take that? Emily, what do you think? Do you recognise this reality that not everyone can work from home?
I completely recognise it in my day-to-day life, and I think sometimes as younger people we're kind of penny pinching to what do we have, but I think we can kind of push that back to our employers, and our employers promise to look after us, and one of Skanska's values is like care for life, so we can kind of push it back and have the conversation with them and how things can work. And I think just by simply flagging the issue to those who are meant to be looking out for us and who are looking out for us, we can hopefully see some change there. But I completely recognise the issue.
Steve?
I think we've got, well, I think all of our homes could probably be better designed, but also I think there's some interesting ideas about places like WeWork and other companies that provide flexible working space, where they've been very busily investing away from areas we've traditionally thought of them being. So I walk past a couple in central London normally on the way to my office, but they've been opening up in other places, smaller towns or on the edge of town. And I think if people haven't got the capacity to work easily from home, making it possible for them to work remotely, but not necessarily from home, is another part of the solution.
Okay, I've been swamped now. It's a great swamp with questions. Edward Lee, this is one for you, George. Satellite backhaul has high latency, creates problems for comms over IP, Zoom, VoIP, other interactive digital tools. George, is that an acceptable compromise?
Well, it depends on actually the satellite network you're going to use. So, so you're absolutely right. The traditional geostationary satellites that we know and have seen in operation for many years do have a significant latency, which can impact IP connectivity. That's absolutely correct. If you look at the new LEO constellations that are being launched at the moment, OneWeb, SpaceX, etc., they're lower orbit, much lower latency, and therefore it should be far more impressive experience. So certainly when I was at OneWeb, so I'm a former OneWebber, we were looking at we were testing latencies of sub 30 milliseconds. So for remote working, that should be absolutely sufficient. And they're very high capacity, high speed networks. So it will absolutely certainly help towards pushing that in the right direction.
Okay, one for everyone, and maybe start with Abi. Question from Matt Thompson. If people are going to opt not to commute every day and work from home, what does the panel think communities of the future will look like? Will everyone want to live in a detached house with a garden? And how will that impact the local sustainability of communities? Abi?
Yeah, I think current situation has made people think about what they're doing with their lives a little bit, but our transport strategy has a really strong focus on place as well. So how can we make good places, design good places where you've got infrastructure that connects people to services? So these things are really important, and some of the talk so far has been on people's choices and giving them different options. So we've really also been thinking about the types of people we have in the Heartland, using some data to look at the types of people personas we have, and what their propensity to change, work from home, are they likely to do that, and really bringing that in some of our work to try and provide the right solutions for the right area for the people we've got in our area as well, because they're very different between the centre of Oxford to some of the rural locations that we have within the Heartland. So providing the right solutions for those areas for the right people is going to be quite important.
Okay. Other question from Joe Burns. It says, I agree we should be providing the place that provides the way for people to live without the need to make commutes or move goods further than they need to be moved. But he says we must do more than just satellite and broadband or the metro elite saving of time on one commute. Emily, I mean, do you have a vision for you know, what the place of the future might look like?
Yeah, I think the place of the future would have it would be really well designed, and I think the same principles would apply, that it would be like holistic, intelligent and iterative. So if it's noting that passenger movements aren't as fluid as it could be, perhaps it needs to create the street furniture and to provide for that. So it's kind of looking at the whole life of the journey and the whole day-to-day life of the person. So is the street furniture not there? So have they not got somewhere to lock their bike? Have they not got somewhere to walk to in a nice environment? So yeah, I think it would think about everything.
Gemma, building on that, a question from Sukhbinder Ubi. The pandemic has given rise to a chance for real behaviour change. Yeah. How is this achieved? How this is achieved is the real question. Gemma, do you know how? Have you got a view about how to achieve this behaviour change?
Yeah, I think you have to understand people's barriers and why they don't want to work from home, or what's actually preventing them from doing so. And it is about behaviour change. You know, the idea of, you know, when the pandemic first hit, you know, I don't mind sharing that I had that nervous chat with my line manager about being stuck inside the four walls for the next foreseeable. It certainly didn't fill me with joy, but we learn to adapt, and we always have done as humans. It's one of the best strengths that we do adapt. We just need to make sure that it's fair and it's an agile environment. And I love the idea that Emily said, you know, we're very much about that sort of dynamic travel, the idea that your entire place morphs to the requirements it needs every single day, which is changeable. And I also wanted to go back about, you know, the planning of the houses as well. The houses that we erected back in the 1980s were for those requirements back then. And of course, today's requirements are going to change even more so. But I think one thing that's really key is to bring in, and I do agree with this, net carbon zero within transport infrastructure too. It's something we should all be factoring every single minute of our lives. But I think working from home is just a part of everyday journey now. It's just what you do.
Question though, point from Kathy Keeler. Young children often do not like people working from home as they feel it is in competition with their protection. Is that where are you on that, Gemma? Is there a conflict of family needs?
So I haven't had an 8-year-old stuck by my side for the last 6 months. There has been conflict, but I actually really have enjoyed the fact that we can, you know, become quite succinct with our education, with our work, and with our living life. You know, we'd often take a break and go on walks together. We'd often make sure that, you know, I'm more aware of what she's doing on the laptop and more aware of what she's learning about, and actually becoming more educated myself about children's requirements than I would have ever had the opportunity to do in post-COVID, pre-COVID world.
Okay, a couple of quick questions before we break for a quick coffee break. Benjamin Boreham, Steve, could there be scope for converting existing cars to hydrogen electric rather than scrapping them and buying another one?
Yes, there is some scope. There's a rather, for those of you who are into that sort of thing, there's a rather entertaining program on the television at the moment called Vintage Voltage, where a company is converting any number of classic and older vehicles, including a Royal Enfield motorbike, which they did in a recent episode. At the moment, it's an expensive process. Let's not make any bones about it, but it is something alongside hydrogen where I could certainly see people who want a particular style of vehicle might well be willing to pay the extra to have that, but to have that with the zero tailpipe option.
Okay. Final question, and I'll put this probably, I think, to Abi. I think Abi, is the big answer to return to a mixed development, residential, workplace, rather than zoning in planning? I mean, I suppose does EEH and its planning need to sort of rethink the way that communities actually are developing to actually embrace this kind of mixture between residential, perhaps increasing the encouraging more of a development in urban areas?
Yeah, I think we've in our transport strategy really outlined the fact that planning and transport need to work together to create good places. Obviously, if you've got planning and transport working together, you can create places where you've got almost best of both worlds. I think working with our local planning authorities is really the way forward in terms of them also helping to decide what the future is for their environments. So I think you've got to bring in planning and transport together because the two work as one. To think about how to create those places to provide good outputs for the areas.
Abi, George, Gemma, Steve and Emily, thanks so much there for a great panel session, and thanks very much to everybody on the line for some brilliant questions. Sorry if I didn't get to all of them. There are a large number coming in. They're flicking through my screen very quickly, and I'm trying to get to as many as I can. If I haven't got to one of your questions yet, then do resend it and make me aware of it. But I'm trying to get through them all. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us there for that session. We're going to have a quick 10-minute, put the kettle on, have a cup of coffee. I've actually got some coffee here, which I'm working my way through, but I'll go and refill it, I think. So have a 10-minute break. We're going to be back at 11:30 and not a second beyond that.